Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the MiFOOD Webinar Series number 6 on food security at emerging urban spaces in India. My name is Zhenzhong Si. I'm a project research manager of the MiFOOD project here at Plausible School of International Affairs in Canada. The Migration and Food Security, or the MiFOOD project, is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The project aims to design and implement a new and innovative high-impact global research and knowledge mobilization agenda focused on the neglected interactions between migration and food security within the Global South. The project is being implemented by the Hungry Cities Partnership, or the HCP, which is a research collaboration between over 90 researchers and partner organizations in 13 countries. I would encourage everyone to check out our website at hungrycities.net. You will find various research projects we're working on right now, and also research outputs in relation to food security and migration. We also have various other resources available there. So before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University's Waterloo campus and the Plausible School of International Affairs are located on the shared traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not to engage in conflict. From the Hyderabad Proclamation of October 25th, 1784, this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the river, which is a grand river, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in proportion to the head of the said river. The proclamation was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of their original territory. Now let me introduce our speakers today. Our speaker, Professor Irudaya Rajan, is chairman of the International Institute of Migration and Development, IIMAD, Kerala, and a former professor at the Center for Development Studies. Currently, he is the chair of the KNOMAD, the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, a World Bank working group on internal migration and urbanization. He was one of the expert committee members to advise the government of Kerala on COVID-19, and he has published in international journals on the social, economic, demographic, psychological, and political implications of migration on individuals, community, economy, and the society. Since 2010, Professor Rajan has been the editor of the annual series India Migration Report, and since 2017, the South Asia Migration Report, published by the Routledge. He was the founding editor-in-chief for the journal Migration and Development. And I should say that this work that Professor Rajan is presenting today is a joint work with 2 other researchers, Chetan, Choithani, and also Abdul, Jaleel. And they are also here today to, they will join us in the Q&A session. And thank you for 3 of you for joining us today. And if you have any questions during this presentation, please post them in chat or use the Q&A function. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation. So without further ado, let's welcome our speaker, Professor Rajan.
Thank you so much for this introduction. But I would like to start with thanking Jonathan, probably a few years back, when he asked me if I can join when they were applying for the SSHRC partnership grant, when I was at Center for Development Studies as a professor. I agreed to join, and then the proposal was submitted, and they got a 7-year grant from the SSHRC partnership grant. And then I moved from CDS to the new place called IIMAD. And then one of the meeting, Jonathan was asking me that you should look at it, maybe the state of art paper as a India partner. The look at the social food security on emerging urban spaces in India, some type of a state of art paper or a art chapter. And when we were started talking, then I was started thinking to develop this thing. And I spoke to Chetan, who has done probably extensive work on food security, and with the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. Then later we also joined by Abdul, Jaleel from National Institute of Nutrition in Hyderabad. Both were basically working on nutrition, food security. So I thought this is also an opportunity to work with probably the young scholars who have been trained at IIPS Mumbai, where I did my PhD several years back. I did my PhD in 82, 87 in Mumbai. I think they were all studied there at some point of time, both Abdul and Chetan. So I thought it's also to bring back people who are working on them, put a team and develop this paper. I think this is a hard work of Chetan, Abdul, putting this data, because I will be talking more on that, to put some type of state of art paper. I think this is still in work in progress. We have a draft paper ready, but we will be putting the final paper as soon as possible as a working paper with the MiFOOD series. And so I would like to take the opportunity to thank Jonathan for providing this opportunity to work on this particular work. Now let me move on. What we are going to say based on our work for almost a few months now. And this is the what is called the. So there are 4 key messages we want to start with, to telling you that some type of what's happening around. Urban center economic growth in many parts of the global south, including precarious urban transition due to lack of decent jobs. We have seen it during COVID-19, how the cities were being handled by the policy makers. We have seen that. And even at the larger cities, there is a policies of exclusionary. For example, if you look at a city like Mumbai, we have somebody owning the private jet, like a private airplane by themselves. At the same time, people are not able to have even 1 meal a day. So you have a high, income inequality at the major cities, probably in the urban cities and the global south. And there is also a transition of people moving from the rural, a large scale internal migration, and that leads to some of them carrying their poverty back to city, and then we call them urban poor, and that leads to a lot of malnutrition and other related issues, including overweight, which we'll be discussing a little bit. And the final point is that there is a lack of data to study this. I think this is something, a perennial problem. That's why this paper will be basically some type of a teaser for a future work, which all 3 of us want to take up, maybe part of the MiFOOD project, maybe next year, to understand, because there is a database is missing. So we have put it from different database, something to get a story out of this particular paper. So we have used several data. Of course, we are mentioning few data here for you people to look at it. One is the census data, which talks about urbanization, urban growth, and towns, so that we know exactly what is the status of the urbanization process, urbanization in India. Then we're also using, probably some of you may be familiar with the National Family Health Survey, which has completed 5 rounds. It has some data on nutrition and food consumption, especially on weight, overweight, stunted among children. So we thought we will also explore that, both rural, urban, as well as poor and non-poor. And then we have also data on food prices, because when you talk about food security, it also has something we should discuss on purchasing power. So we should talk about food prices, inflation. These are all affecting the people who are not able to earn enough money. So what what they are sacrificing. Are they sacrificing food to take care of other expenses, food and non-food? So these are certain issues we are discussing. And then other data such as land use, how the land being converted from the agricultural to non-agricultural. Because of that, there are areas which used to do food production, which they are just now cutting down. They are making big buildings close to the cities, even they are going beyond cities. I think these are certain data, whatever available, we have put a story for all of you. Now, if you look at it, there is a, today in the world, we are talking about the urban population has almost overtaken the rural population, if you look at it. So, globally, we are talking about urban age. Urban age. We cannot go on talking about rural because people are pushed into urban areas because they think that there is some employment. I think there is some hope. People are coming, like dreaming to go to cities, because if I go to cities, at least I can earn some money, I can eat little bit, I can send money back home. And they're also talking about feeding the rural poor. And we can see that. But the point is that, but not many people talk about food security there. That is something very, very important. In fact, recently we were doing a study for the nomad thematic work on urbanization and migration. We were talking with somebody in Iran. They said 75% in Iran is fully urban. They said we cannot hold on the cities now. They are talking about de-urbanization, de-urbanization, because how long the city can hold, what is the limit to the population? So they said, sir, last 5 to 6 years, there is not many people coming into city because the city is almost like, it's like houseful status. So highly urbanized. I think this is going to happen in many countries in the South. I think probably India will be one of the examples, which we'll see, in a few minutes from now. And when you look at it, in this particular food security in urban age, there are two things that are happening. One is, as I said earlier, more people now live in urban than the rural areas. Food security increasingly acquiring an urban character, raising questions on production, access, and distribution. Because some of the productions are done in the rural areas, then access, then distributing, transport system. All those things are very, very, very important for food security. And then developing countries in Asia and Pacific that have high food insecurity witnessing rapid urban transition. Like we talk about demographic transition, we are talking about urban transition, rural to urban, and what are its implications, not just income and employment. We should also talk about food security, how much money is spent on food by those people who are in the city, what we call them the purchasing power. But in spite of that, that is very, very important. Urban food security is completely a neglected subject in many circles. In fact, the 2022 edition of the World City Report of UN Habitat that puts a vision of creating sustainable cities and resilient urban communities covers in detail matters of urban economic growth, climate change, public health, poverty and inequality, and infrastructure and governance, and so on. But food security mentioned only in passing remark, which I used to tell in India. When India people prepare the economic survey report with the 2,000 pages, not even a single word called migration is there. I think this is happening because they talk about so many things. Of course, these are all important for urban, but then the food security, purchasing power, inflation, all those things, accessibility, pricing, inflation, I think these are all not mentioned. Similarly, other specialized UN agencies of FAO, which leads the international efforts to improve global food and nutrition security, routinely treat as rural issue. It is annual Plaxi report. They said it's a rural issue. Urban, this is not a big issue, as stated by some of their publications. Pairing research by MiFOOD partners. Of course, we have to thank Jonathan for that, leading a lot of work on food security related issue, including a publication in Migration Development Journal. They are publishing a book right now, and some of the research being conducted right now. Academic research also shows this neglect, including what we call them International Food Policy Research Institute. I think they talk about that, but not so much either research or the finance is funding for doing research on this food security, which is, we feel that it is neglected. Now, what are the plausible reasons for the neglect of food security? Now, if you look at it, most of the people talking about it's a rural center. It's a rural center, and they talk about climate change, but somehow they think that this is not the problem of urban, but we have seen that recent shocks due to economic downturns, COVID-19 and the ongoing Ukraine and Russia war has further enforced this issue. Food security is an important issue. And then uncritical separation of cities. I think this is very, very important. In India, we talk about smart cities. Smart cities, I don't think they talk about food security. Smart cities mean they talk about infrastructure, they talk about Wi-Fi, they talk about roads, they talk about building, they talk about even housing sometime. In India, right now they're talking about one country, one ration card. So, but I think this is something very important. I think they're realizing now that urban is always advantage compared to the rural area. I think we should rethink the dimension of the food security in the current context. And if you look at that, southern urban transition and food security, if you look at that, the rural, we talk about global south, urban-centric economic growth. I think many economists somehow believe if you increase urbanization, which will lead to economic growth. I think they are talking about increasing urbanization, of course, which leads to large-scale migration. They don't talk about even what is the contribution of migration into the urbanization. I think this is something very, very important. They think that it's a what we call them. If you make people urban, probably the economic growth will be there. Where they are not talking really on the the food security. And then they all talk about not still talking about relocating. We are just moving the rural poor to the urban poor. There are studies being happening on urban poor. But urban poor, they talks about employment and income, but urban poor, are they getting enough food? I think this question has to be discussed quite often. I think this is important for us to look at it because this is something is also, we should look at it. And the third point is a growing, what we call them, this internal migration. For example, India has 400 million people are currently living in a place they are not born. Out of that 100 million are hardcore internal migrants who are going to city to work. And then exclusively, large cities and of course increased slums we see in many of the global south. I think this is very, very important, growing significance of the rural and urban migration. Now, with this background, we are going to propose, the Indian context and will provide you 2-3 possible explanations on India's urbanization and give you some 3 points to elaborate on what is currently happening on food security. Of course, India, most of you know that number of chronically undernourished people, mostly in the rural areas. I think this is something, and it's agricultural nutrition disconnect. People are working in the agriculture. Agriculture is still, people say predominant, then they say they are producing, then what is the food issues? And urban center economic growth, as I said earlier, massive shift of employment and growing significance of rural and urban migration. I think this is something very, very important. So this is the Indian context we are going to place this particular presentation. If you look at the Indian context, of course, the data what we have is based on the 2011 census. As many of you know that there was no 2021 census, but it gives you some idea on the trends in urbanization. And many of us, including the urban experts, believe that the estimates are given by the Indian government or the Indian census is underestimate. We'll elaborate on that point. If you look at the actual data, the absolute number of urban dwellers increased by 91 million between 10 years, 2001 and 11. Just 10 years, the urban population has increased by 91 million. This is period to 2011. And 11 to 21, probably we expect much more than 90 million because India also pursuing what we call the smart city mission. Smart city mission means basically attracting people to cities. I think that is also going to make what is called some important point for us. And rapid urban-centric growth, which we told them very clearly that everybody talks about cities. So not automatically, it is urban-centric economic growth. And then why this India's urbanization is riddle, for example. One is, we suggested earlier, it is an exclusionary urbanization, lack of decent jobs. 90% of them jobs are informal. We have seen that people lost jobs during COVID-19 cities, and high cost of living in large cities. We talk about big cities, there is a high cost of living. There are many families probably spending more money on their housing than their food. And of course, then they are not permanent. The family shifting predominantly male migration, circular migration, sending back money, sacrificing their food, probably to send back to their spouses or their parents and children. These are certain issues. It's exclusively urbanization. And along with that, we also have the three criteria for urbanization. One is 400 persons per square kilometer, population of 5,000 or more, and at least 75% of the male workers engaged in non-farm employment. This is what the census definition of defining urban. And if you look at it, some of the analysis done based on the census data itself, the census towns are expanding. That means, it's like we are annexing a lot of medium-sized cities, small cities, they are close to urban, but they may not be called urban. They are new census towns. And you can see that we have 2532 new census town emerged, which was equal to census town growth in the past century. That means the 2001 and 11, that new census town is equal to the last 100 years. And this is again talking about, are we really understanding the India's urbanization? I think we are not. I think that currently whatever we talk about India's urbanization is much lower than that. And then if you look at it much more clearly, based on the graph which was made based on the census data, nearly 11,000 settlements as per 2011 census, where 75% of the more male workers are engaged in non-farm occupations. You can see that a lot of places are non-farm occupation. Like for example, when you talk about Kerala, you can see that graph map. Kerala is neither rural nor urban. You can walk from the whole Kerala, it will look like urban, but then the urbanization is only 50%. Half of them are rural, but they are not rural, they are basically urban. I think that the definitional issue also making much more issue for the India's urbanization. These are the reasons what we are talking about. Now we will spend some time on three important points on the linkages of India's urban transition and food security. I think these are the 3 points we are going to spend more time on, that growing significance of non-farm incomes and urban dwellers, as basically urban dwellers are buying food. Maybe when they were in the village, they are not buying. Maybe something was growing around the area, they may get for very less prices, but now it is being transported from certain cities, and cities don't produce some of the food, so it can come from there, the price goes up. So we are going to talk about that. And then the dietary changes and overweight, improved income, dietary changes and overweight, and then the farmland conversion for urban use. I think this is hugely happening. We don't have latest updated data, but we will be talking about conversion of the farmland to non-farm purpose, especially to expand what we call them, expand the urban cities. You are being converting these rural areas. Let me go by one on these 3 points. One is that you can look at that non-farm incomes and urban dwellers now become food buyers. They are buying food. And you can look at it, many households at these places hold on to land as a source of security. They may have some land and agriculture, but that still forms a broad part of livelihood portfolio. But land and agriculture no longer sufficiently fulfill household food and nutrition security need. Even somebody has a land, they still have to buy outside food. Significant proportion of smallholders in India are net food buyers. I think the graph, which you can see that India, 74% compared to place like Cambodia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, 74% of them are net buyers among smallholders in select ASEAN countries. This data from 2011. We have to look at it. We can get the latest data on that. And non-farm livelihood diversification can provide an important cushion to deal with dwindling agrarian prospect and improving living standards and food security. But detachment of agriculture with food provisioning also mean greater reliance on market. People are now relying on market. I think this is, when you are relying on market, the market is functioning in a different way. Demand, supply, we know about cereals issue, we know about onion can change even the politics in Kerala. The price of some of the food grains, pulses can change because that some of the people may not be able to buy at all during when there's a high price. And you continue to discuss on this what is called the non-farm incomes and urban dwellers as net food buyers. Food price volatility since 2000 global food crisis. I think food crisis affects whom? food inflation is a key issue facing the world today. You can look at the wholesale price and of food commodities in India for the 2012 and 22. You can look at the fluctuation of food prices, cereals, pulses, fruits, vegetables, eggs, meat. This is a data based on the Office of the Economic Advisor of Indian government. You see the data, so much fluctuations. So net food buyers of urban household have their food budget dwindled. So now we should look at even household family budget, which I was talking about, how many households are able to buy the food, or whatever the income they earn, how much they are going to spend on that. We have some data on food and non-food through National Sample Survey, but we should look at it exactly how much they are buying. And in India, you can look at it, fruits and vegetables are presently over 100% higher. And even basic cereals, which form the bulk of diets of the poor, are 70%. So food remittances, a lot of studies done by my board group and Jonathan Kress, you can see that, but it is unlikely in India. Food remittances, we have some studies coming up, but this is going to be very, very important for all of us. And then if you continue to look at that, you can see that urban poor often reduce food consumption and dietary diversity. Because then they will go for the food, which is, we call them junk food, whatever we talk about. So our analysis of the India's National Family Health Survey, which I told you, a new database. Of course, the survey is almost 20 years old. They are running the fifth, this is the fifth NFHS results, which we are presenting right now. The sixth NFHS is already on. So you can imagine this, using this data, you can see urban children aged below 5 years are significantly more likely to experience any forms of anthropometric failure than their rural peers. You can see that within urban areas, compared to the wealthy household, more than twice as many urban children from poor families are stunted, 21.5% versus 46.8%, and underweight. So now this is some type of outcome indicators, which you can see that because what you eat, what type of food basket that the family is giving to their children, especially we are talking about less than 5-year-old children. Now they are growing up, they are not getting enough malnutrition. What are we going to see them as young people, productive labor force in the future? I think we are in the very crux of that. This is, we are talking about children. And these children will be, within 15 years, they will be young adults. And then they will be, labor force participation. If they are not properly given food at their younger ages, what will be the implication for their own life expectancy, their own, work, healthy? I think this is a big question. I think we have to discuss further on that. And then you can look at it, improved income. People say they get some income in the cities, but the dietary changes are happening, and overweight and obesity. This is also now a big topic. One side you see overweight, and obesity. Urban transition, because it's of the food basket. Urban transition is generally associated with nutrition transition. People change the food patterns. Somebody moving from rural to urban, there's a large shift in the structure of diet. What they were eating in the villages, probably what they're eating in the cities will be completely different type of food. Shift from farm to non-farm job generally improves income, which in turn leads to increased demand for calories, dietary diversity. India's urban transition is changing the food environment in the country, and overweight and obesity are also on the rise. You can see that underweight higher in urban areas, whereas overweight prevalence greater in urban areas also. However, a large proportion of rural women suffer from overweight than underweight, which is perhaps indicative of dietary changes at rural-urban transition. Between that means we are not, rural, semi-rural or semi-urban than urban. I think this is what we should do more research on that. It's not a city. City, maybe the small towns and then the villages. What is happening to this, what is called the nutrition pattern or the structure of diets? And you continue on the dietary changes, you can see that again, the food consumption data from the NFHS among 15 to 49 years in India, basically reproductive age group data. We have data on what is called the urban diets, generally better than the rural, and a greater proportion of urban women consume fruits, eggs, fish, and meats versus their rural counterparts. We have data on what we call the urban rural. But consumption of fried food, accelerated drinks also higher in the urban areas. It talks about the food availability in the cities. Our analysis shows access to the healthy food items such as fruits and vegetables varied by economic status. For example, proportion of women who drink milk daily is 33% in the poorest quintile, while this proportion in the richest quintile is 66.4. 66.4. Similarly, daily food consumption among women from poorest and richest quintile was 6% and 22.5% respectively. That means poor population in urban areas often find it difficult to afford costly, healthy food such as fruits, milk, and rely on low-cost cereal-based diets. I think this is another way of looking at the consumption pattern in India. And the third and most important point, I think this is we are coming to the final slide. Third and most important point is the conversion of rural land to urban use. Because rural area, people think that let us sell the land, convert into urban area. They are constructing big apartment, big cities. People are coming to cities, but they are living very close to the cities in big apartment. So the land which was used earlier to cultivate is completely converted for the urban use. That means one side the food production probably also coming down. We have to look at the data, but then the area available for making food products, and now that has been converted. This is something India's urban transition is doing. So Indian urban transition is also affecting food security through the changes in the land use pattern. I think we need a separate study on land use patterns with farmland increasingly being converted into support urban growth. This is happening in most part of India, including Kerala, for example. In fact, many of the construction done near the cities are also not environmental. Recently, 2 of the big buildings in Kerala was brought down, 2 big multi-story building, because they are all, maybe paid through corruption. They are converting the land, and it's not environmentally even viable. During 2001 and 9, 700,000 hectares of agricultural land lost, a conservative estimate, and urbanization is one of the leading driver. We quote the others: smaller places witnessing faster land use changes, land loss predominantly in state with higher agricultural land suitability. I think when we talk about economic corridor, economic growth, highway infrastructure, and personal housing in helping the farmer villages into the urban world, I think this also has to be studied. And what are the implications for that? While there is no evidence of immediate decline in overall food production, perhaps due to the intensification, we talk about green revolution, we talk about white revolution, this does raise questions about food availability decline when benefits of technological intervention subside. India's food bowl states of Punjab and Haryana facing severe groundwater depletion, changing due to farm intensification. There's also the water crisis. In fact, there are studies coming out very clearly indicate some of the farmer household investing so much money on deep, what is called this groundwater, and then the poor household not able to get water because they go very deep and digging so that they get water, whereas the next household will not get water. A lot of money is being invested on harvesting what is called the groundwater in some of the cities. Second, shift in cultural values towards farming, particularly among the youth who may withdraw from farming altogether, which poses a challenge to long-term sustainability of production. I think today, many of the farmers' families, their children are not into farming. I think we should look at it. If nobody is going to be farming, the farmland will be vacant. We see in certain areas, either the workers are not available. There are people are migrating to farm in place like Punjab, because Punjab people are moving outside Punjab. So automatically, people who can, create agricultural food, and they are getting into the other places to create farm food. Third, the urban growth is also fueling the speculation in which traditionally disadvantaged communities are being further dispossessed their land. We talk about scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, the forest land. This reduced food availability will also negatively affect food access among urban poor who depend on market purchases. I think this is the broad finding based on whatever data we can put it through the available data. We want to create a story. As I said earlier, the important 3 points. One is what we said earlier, non-farm incomes and urban dwellers as net food fires. The second, improved incomes, dietary changes, and overweight and obesity. Third, and most important, farmland conversion for urban use and food security. With this, I'm going to stop here. There is a conclusion which I don't want to read right now. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rajan. This is a very informative presentation. I think you covered a huge amount of issues that we need some time to digest. Meanwhile, I just want to open the floor to the audience and see anyone has any questions, please. You could post your questions in chat or in Q&A. While we're waiting for people to think about their questions, let me ask you a question, Professor Rajan, or maybe a question also for the other two speakers. So we learned that in India, there's this rapid urbanization process, and more and more urban poor people face food insecurity challenges in the city. And you mentioned also that the rural population is also becoming net food buyers. So it seems like more and more people need food, but we have less production here in the country. So I just remembered that in the Chinese scholarship, when we talk about food security, people always ask the question, who will feed China? That's the famous book published by Lester Brown in 1995, which has incentivized a huge amount of policy debate on the future of food security for China. But I think the same thing happens here in India. We have seen a lot of similarities between the two developing countries. So in terms of that, how do you think about the future of food security in India? Like, will the country rely more on food imports in the long run? And what are some of the policies to address the food challenges in the country?
Yeah, Chetan will respond to that. You can
Chetan, you're on mute. Yeah.
Also, there are two questions in the chat box, Chetan.
Okay, I'll look at them. Thank you so much for your question. And so I think there were a few questions there, not just one question. So when we're looking at, in terms of the overall food availability, when we were looking at the data, what we see is that there's a lot of land that is being converted to meet the demand for urban residential and commercial purposes. But we're also seeing that there isn't any evidence that says that food availability overall declines, at least not immediately. But it does, as Professor Rajan said, it does raise some questions about the long-term sustainability of food production, and especially when we look at what is happening to the states of Punjab and Haryana, where since 1970, the Green Revolution reforms and the farm intensifications have, while improving overall food availability at the country level, but has also led to major issues, and groundwater depletion is one of the major ones. But in terms of and how this affects the access issue. So what we are trying to do here is I think the rural urban transition in India is very, very complex, and we're trying to get our head around it, and it's actually very complex. It's messy, but what we see is that what is driving this transition, one of the leading drivers is this massive employment shift out of agriculture. But that doesn't mean that people quit agriculture. People do tend to hold on to land, but land sizes in India, the average land holding are very, very small, which means that they do not, I think, average land holding is about it's about 1.225 hectare or something, which means that it doesn't fulfill the adequately fulfill the food needs of everyone. And then now you have, of course, these other non-food needs, particularly in a growing section of rural dwellers wanting to invest in their kids' education. So you see migration from rural areas to urban areas, but because these cities, large cities, are exclusionary, most jobs are informal. Most people are unable to carve out more permanent lives, right? So what they do is they circulate between rural and urban worlds, and they send remittances back home, which then are invested in in buying food, in constructing houses, which is also changing the spatial nature of these places. And one of the things that is happening is that people are using their farmland to of course to build their personal houses, better houses, right? Which is also driving growth at the rural urban transition.
Thank you, Chetan. Anyone else wants to add anything here?
Yeah, I think I have few points to add. I think Jonathan wanted to raise his hand, so maybe I'll add few points. One is that I think there are two questions on this food prices. I think we have some data on the food prices at the local level, because at the state level, partly because many of the salaries of some of the employees is indexed to the price inflation, not the poor people. So the richer people, especially this is something we can get the food prices. And the second question, I saw that what is between the large and smaller cities? I don't think we have looked at it in this paper. I think definitely we are talking about smart cities in the country. We have 100 cities in India. How the availability of food prices, food availability, purchasing power probably will vary depend upon and also new cities are coming up. But new capital is built in Andhra Pradesh for the state. Now if you talk about the new cities coming up, I think probably the food supermarket might be one of the things which I saw the questions on that. So this is something, I think what we thought about earlier itself, I think the research on this is much what is called the scandy. In fact, our research is basically even, like picking up from different people and creating a story. Like one side, you have land, and I think Margaret asked one question, I look at it. I think also what happened now, the international migration is picking up beyond Kerala. We have Andhra Pradesh, and then lot of money is being invested on housing. If you look at the remittances on how the remittance is spent, first is food, then second thing is buying land and housing, apartment. So the lot of remittance is also building this land market. So automatically they also lead to converting the farmland into non-farm land, like in many states, where they have money to buy houses, because remittance is also being used after the day-to-day expenses. This is coming as a very big thing. I will stop here. We'll listen to Jonathan's queries, and then probably we can pick up more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Chanjan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just interested in the opening discussion about the attitude of international organizations and how they ignore the linkages between food security and migration. I think this is indisputable. My question is this disconnect reproduced at the level of national and state government and local government in global South generally, but in India as well? Are they more aware of these connections and the policy implications, or do they simply reproduce this idea that's coming down from above? Thanks.
Yeah, I think, Jonathan, you are right. I think the Indian government is realizing that, especially we saw during COVID-19, for example, Kerala, which I was part of the government to advise the government during COVID-19, we are talking about community kitchen. We were aware of the food thing. In fact, the Indian government were offering 5 kg rice to each individual during COVID-19 through the public distribution system. It is happening. And even the government talking about one country, one ration card, so that they can get some food at the local level. I think it's being talked about. I think it has come to the attention of the policy makers and the government. Food is something, like we talk about, it's a basic minimum. You should have 3 meals a day. I think that 3 meals a day, I think it's coming up in a big way. But the policies and programs, we have to wait and see. But something is coming up. Something is coming up, Jonathan. Chetan, you want to add?
Yeah, just to add to that, I do think that there is a disconnect between, there's very little. I mean, I think after COVID, we've seen some response from the policymakers, but I don't think there is any appreciation, particularly for the linkages between migration and food security. And I think these two, if you also look at how these two agendas are pursued, particularly in India, they're not very different to how they are at the global level. So, for example, food security in India is still viewed in terms of overall food availability. So we have National Food Security Mission, that aims to increase food production, right? There are these quantitative targets on how much food do we need to support growing population, but not really the access issue. Migration, and I think Professor Rajan would be a better person to comment, but I think migration policy makers are only, I think COVID crisis was a reminder that, India has these many migration, and it's only now that I think it was in 2017 that the government accepted that there are about 100 million people on the move in any given year, but there's very little attempt to understand migration. It's dynamic. So some of the surveys and census, they capture more permanent forms of mobility and circular and seasonal migration, which is what it's the most dominant, remains ignored. So, but I think overall there seems to be this larger disconnect in India too. Thanks.
Thank you. I saw that in Q&A, there are a few questions and we already touched upon some of them, but there's one question about from Bharat on the impact of urbanization on food production via the conversion of land. Is its impact greater in some states than others in India?
Chetan, yeah.
So the research that is available, the data that is available shows that farmland conversion is much higher in states that are growing faster. So particularly states, I think in 2000, Indian government started building what is called the economic corridors or special economic zones, which required taking a lot of rural land, so I think we see that states that have grown rapidly economically are witnessing greater conversion. But in terms of its impact on food production per se, as I said, that we don't know those linkages because there isn't any. What we're seeing is that overall food production hasn't declined, and I think that's because of farm in agriculture intensification. But it needs a bit more research. But we do see more land being converted in states which are growing faster than those which are economically less dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there are new economic corridors, which I think Chetan discussed. And also expanding the cities. Now the city, for example, Delhi is not just Delhi. It has gone to other states now. Like Noida. Like that, lot of expansion is happening. Then automatically you are annexing the rural lands, and converting into big shopping complexes. Educational institutions are coming up in a big way. Growing of higher educations, like big universities coming to India right now. Because Indian government has already opened. Many foreign universities can come and set up their offices in India, their universities in India. Maybe Wilfred Laurier can come to India now. You can have an university, a wing in India. Then automatically you need land. So I think many universities are coming up to India. Like people go to Dubai, like educational city. There may be cities will develop, then what you need land. Which land you are going to get? There is no urban land. So automatically you will go little closer to the urban land. New airports are coming up. New airports are coming up. We have now close to 100 airports. So airports means you need large tracts of land. Like we have 5 airports in Kerala. So I think this is going to be, when you talk about development, so-called development, automatically land is being squeezed. So the conversion probably right now, I think as Chetan says, we have the production has not declined, but I am not sure it will continue to be like that. Because one side we have the production is increasing, but still the farm families, we are not having new people to work in the farm. Because the farmer's son is not going to be a farmer. He's going to be in the non-farm employment. So automatically there will be we may not get workers. We may have farm land, but somebody has to work. Otherwise you have to export like farm workers to get you have a farm worker special scheme to Canada earlier, historically, to build farms. I don't know. So we may think of new novel methods to, to keep the farm land active by doing some production.
Yeah, thank you. Sujata also asked a question about, we mentioned the different experiences between large and secondary cities. And he also asked about the question of food price data. And do you have anything to add in response to those questions?
Chetan can add, yeah.
So I think, there is very little research on urban food security in general, and we don't really have a comparison of large and secondary city, except that what we are trying to do in this research is to actually shift the focus even below, like even going to places that are that were formerly agrarian zones, and trying to understand the food security implication of urbanization that's happening there. But we don't, I don't really have an answer to that. What we, what the evidence, reading of evidence from sort of this larger exclusionary urbanization literature suggests that urban poor face the food security challenges faced by urban poor particularly are not very different in these large and secondary cities, because these secondary cities in India also are actually quite large. They're not like million plus cities, but they're still there's still 500,000 people or so. So they are so I'm not sure if I answered that question, but I think this is something that that we are trying to understand a bit more, but we're also trying to understand what is happening to food security at the lower echelons of India's urban system, if you like. Yeah.
Thank you. I saw a question for Ning.
Yes.
Could you please speak a little bit on the most commonly used food retail outlets in these newly developed urban areas? So for example, street vendors, small grocery stores, or supermarkets. Has COVID led to any structural changes in the food retail sector?
Chetan, yeah.
I think that we don't. So these are still small urban places. So we don't really see we see increase in consumption of consumption of processed food because many of these. There are different types of these emerging urban spaces. Some are located in proximity to large cities, so you get access to the food that is available in big cities. Others in very remote locations, so there you see some sort of food retailing, informal food vendors, but not at a scale that you see in cities like Bombay or Delhi, right, where street food is very, very common. But there certainly are no supermarkets at these small urban spaces, particularly those that are not in proximity to large cities. So it's mostly small retail-based grocery shops.
Okay. Okay.
Mm.
That's interesting. Do any one of you want to say more about Margaret's question? So it's on the matter of land ownership. How does migration inform land economies in that migration requires funding and land migration? Land might become collateral for that process.
No, as I said earlier, for this question, I think that, as I said earlier, the remittance is also being used to buy land, converting land, and then they, the people, maybe they had a land they sold and went to migration, then they come back, they are going to buy a land in the cities. So automatically they will buy apartments. So I think the remittances, how the remittances is fueling the land economics and the housing market, especially for converting the farm and non-farm land. I think that is another research I think we should look at it, because I think, there are all linked questions. I think there are a lot of very linked ones. So it requires more research on that, how this remittances is fueling the housing and land economics in Indian context.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
Yeah, please.
So, I think that sort of goes. This question goes back to the classic sort of debate in migration studies, which is that who migrates really, and again, this is a research by John Connell in 1976. That suggested that the poor and also Michael Lipton, poorest are least likely to migrate because they don't have the financial and social capital to engage or partake in migration. And I think it does apply. So some of the field research that I've been involved in tells me that it does apply to land can become collateral to finance the cost of migration for international migration, particularly to Persian Gulf, but not for domestic migration. I think that we don't see, and what we are seeing is that the poor are as likely to migrate as the slightly better off sections, when it comes to, engaging in circular and seasonal migration in that, So I don't think for internal or domestic migration, land, it helps that, it helps to borrow money if you have land. But it doesn't necessarily define your propensity to migration, if that answers the question.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think our time is up today, and thank you to three of the presenters. And this is very interesting discussion. And I just want to say that thank you everyone for joining us today. And please follow us on our Twitter and Facebook account called Moving on Empty. And we will have more events coming in the coming few months. And also, we are having a conference tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, morning time here in Canada. So if you go to the Balsillie School webpage and go to events, you'll see that it's called the Second Annual International Migration and Conference on Food Security and Migrants on the Move. So if you are interested, you're welcome to register and join us. It's free. And thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you in the future events. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.